Welcome back to Quiet Thunder, where we bring light to the stories families tried for decades to keep in the dark. Today's story belongs to Clara Vance. For nearly 10 years, Clara was erased by a family of elite architects who measured human worth strictly by blue-penciled blueprints and magazine covers. But when Clara walked uninvited into her sister's high society wedding, she didn't just crash a party. She brought down a three-generation dynasty without ever raising her voice. Before we begin Clara's journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's dive into the quiet collapse of the Vance Empire. My name is Clara Vance. I am 28 years old, and the last time my mother addressed me in public before my sister's wedding, she called me an overhead cost. She said it in a glass-walled conservatory overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by 200 black-tie guests while I held a flute of sparkling apple cider I had politely accepted from a passing waiter. "Why is our overhead cost sitting in row 3? My mother murmured, her voice coated in expensive silk. 9 years of utter radio silence, and that was her grand opening line. My sister, Eleanor, turned slightly toward her wedding photographer, caught my eye, and offered the kind of tight, pitying smile you give to a coffee ring on a white marble countertop. "You weren't meant to be here," Eleanor mouthed. She was right about that. I wasn't meant to be there. What she didn't realize was who had invited me. At 19, what the groom discovered during his toast ended far more than just a wedding reception. It shattered an architectural legacy that had stood for half a century, and I never once had to yell. To understand how a glass conservatory full of Manhattan's elite shattered in 20 minutes, you have to go back 10 years earlier. It starts in a wood-paneled study with a high school graduation ribbon, a table full of roast duck, and a wall of framed architectural awards that featured one noticeably blank matte board. 3 weeks before Eleanor's wedding, an embossed navy envelope arrived at my townhome in Brooklyn. The paper was so thick it felt like a tile sample, addressed to Dr. Julian Mercer and Mrs. Clara Mercer in silver calligraphy that probably cost more than my first apartment's security deposit. Julian usually receives invitations to medical summits or charity galas. I opened it using a silver butter knife while sitting at my kitchen island, mentally reviewing our firm's morning payroll. Then I read the embossed card inside. "The Sterling family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Arthur Sterling, to Eleanor Vance." Eleanor Vance. My older sister. I sat in my sunlit kitchen and read her name 5 times, watching the morning light catch the silver ink. The hardwood floor was cool under my bare feet. The espresso machine hummed softly in the corner. Up in upstate New York, my family was arranging a multi-million-dollar union between 2 prominent design dynasties, and an invitation bearing my married name had slipped right through their guest list screening like a bird flying through a broken window pane. Julian walked into the kitchen, read the card over my shoulder, and placed his mug onto the counter with extreme care. "You don't have to step foot near that venue, Clara," he said gently. "I know," I replied. "Knowing I don't have to go isn't quite the same as wanting to stay away." Julian didn't push back. As an orthopedic surgeon who reconstructs shattered limbs, he understands the delicate line between a scar that has healed and an old joint that simply reacts to changes in atmospheric pressure. We made our game plan right there at the island like 2 corporate strategists. We would attend the ceremony, remain seated near the exit doors, offer our polite congratulations to Arthur, whom Julian knew professionally, and depart before my parents even recognized the sudden drop in temperature. I chose a structured dark gray dress, completely muted, understated, and designed to melt into the architecture. I genuinely believed I was attending as a polite, distant acquaintance. I was wrong in almost every possible metric, and the first structural crack in my composure appeared before I had even finished my glass of water. The Sterling estate was perched on a bluff above the river, a modern masterpiece of poured concrete, floor-to-ceiling glass, and minimalist cedar beams. Valets in black coats swept through the courtyard. A cello duo warmed up under an arbor of white orchids. My parents had always known how to construct an imposing set. Julian was almost immediately drawn into a conversation near the terrace bar with a group of chief administrators from Columbia Presbyterian, which worked out well for me. I drifted toward the glass balcony in my gray dress, watching the river barges pass below, counting down the minutes until the ceremony commenced. That was when my mother's voice carried around the corner of a slate pillar. It was bright, polished, and impeccably controlled, her public voice. "Two families of master builders," my mother was saying, followed by a light chuckle from her companions. "Can you imagine what their children will design?" Then came the sentence that knocked the wind out of my chest like a heavy timber. "Eleanor has always been our sole focus, you see. Our only daughter. We channeled every drop of our heritage into her." Our only daughter. I stood motionless behind that slate pillar, frozen like concrete setting in the cold. I had mentally prepared myself to be the estranged sibling, the black sheep, the girl who walked away to work with her hands. I had not prepared to be thoroughly written out of the family history. Erasure is far cleaner than conflict. It leaves no mess to clean up, just a smooth wall where a door used to be. Somewhere in that sprawling room, my father was holding a glass of scotch, wearing an immaculate bespoke suit, silently agreeing with every word. I looked down at my hands and realized my fingers were trembling against the crystal glass. I forced them to still. I had been trained from childhood that in front of the Vance family, you never let anyone see you lose control. To understand how my family operated, you have to look at the hallway of the house where I grew up. In my parents' home in Westchester, there was a gallery wall. On that wall hung 11 mahogany frames. My grandfather's original drafting licenses, my mother's AIA Fellow Certificate, my father's Urban Design Awards, and various international honors earned by uncles and cousins across 60 years. We referred to it simply as the gallery. Other families talked about their summer cabins or holiday traditions. We talked about the gallery. Sunday dinners were an exercise in corporate review. My mother would sit at the head of the long mahogany table and ask each of us to outline our weekly progress, grading our responses like blue line drafts. Eleanor, for years my senior, always came armed with metrics, top class rankings, design competition trophies, invitations to prestigious summer studios. She was the blue chip stock that yielded reliable returns. I was the other kind of child. I could fix a broken barn door latch, retile a backsplash, or measure out timber framing far more accurately than the hired contractors. But I froze during high-stakes academic reviews and brought home mediocre grades in theoretical geometry that hit the dinner table like flawed brickwork. My mother never raised her voice over a low mark. Yelling implied a lack of emotional control. She simply reallocated her attention away from me, reducing her focus the way a developer liquidates a poor investment. She believed that love was not an innate right, but a dividend paid on demonstrated excellence. There is one specific detail from that house I need you to remember. The summer I turned 15, a 12th mahogany frame was hung at the bottom of the gallery wall, beneath Eleanor's grand prize certificate from the Young Architects League. The frame contained no picture, no diploma, just a blank sheet of off-white matting. When I asked my mother why an empty frame was hanging on the wall, she looked down at me with a tight smile and said, "That space is reserved for your contribution, Clara. Pending." Fast forward to the week I graduated from high school 10 years ago. My mother booked the private dining room at the River Club. A clear sign of serious business, because the River Club was used for press releases and client presentations, never casual celebrations. 24 family members sat around a long white table. I wore a simple yellow linen dress I had purchased myself using money earned from my weekend job at a local hardware store. I felt confident until my aunt took one look at my outfit and whispered, "Well, aren't you courageous wearing off-the-rack linen to the River Club?" My graduation was ostensibly the reason for the gathering, but the dinner had a second act I was completely unaware of. Between the salad and the main course, my mother stood up, tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, and announced that Eleanor had just been accepted into the Master of Architecture program at Yale, with a full merit fellowship. The room instantly erupted into applause. My father led a toast to the next partner of Vance and Associates. Uncles leaned across the table to debate urban planning strategies. The waiter quietly placed my main course in front of me, while every head in the room remained turned toward the head of the table. For 20 minutes, I ate my dinner in near isolation at my own celebration, reminding myself that this was simply the family protocol. Eleanor's accomplishment was objectively significant. I had my own practical plan. An apprenticeship program in timber framing and restoration carpentry starting that autumn. followed by night courses in structural drafting. I had paying work lined up, and the brochure was neatly folded in my handbag like a secret map. Then my mother tapped her glass a second time. "And of course," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of gentle, clinical precision, "we must acknowledge Clara." Every face turned toward my end of the table. My mother looked at me the way an inspector examines a hairline fracture in a load-bearing beam. One daughter inherited the Vance architectural vision. My mother announced to 24 relatives, tilting her glass toward Eleanor. The other daughter, well, she inherited the enthusiasm for heavy machinery. She let the pause linger in the air. Silence was always her favorite tool. "A high school diploma is still an achievement," she added with a light chuckle. "We celebrate whatever small milestones we are given." A few relatives offered uncomfortable, polite laughs. My aunt gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, which felt infinitely worse than coldness. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap. 18 years of rigid Vance composure keeping my back straight, and gave them absolutely nothing. No cheers, no autours, no dramatique exit. I finished my meal. It tasted like cardboard. Later that evening, back at the Westchester house, my mother led me into the hallway, tapped the blank 12th frame on the gallery wall with a polished nail, and delivered the family doctrine. "In this house, recognition is earned. This frame remains blank until you produce something worthy of the Vance name. Then it can stay empty forever," I said quietly, "because I am going to build real things, not drawings." My mother stared at me for a cold, silent moment. "Then it will remain an empty reminder," she replied softly, "and everyone who walks through this foyer will know why." She walked upstairs. I stood alone in the quiet hallway under 60 years of framed achievements until the grandfather clock chimed 10, followed by the soft rustle of the screen door opening out onto the back porch. "Come sit down, Clara," a soft voice called out. My grandmother, Evelyn, was sitting on the wooden porch swing in her worn knit cardigan. 2 glasses of cold lemonade already waiting on the small side table. Evelyn was my mother's mother, a fact that always bewildered people who knew them both. Evelyn had worked for 35 years as a master site supervisor for public parks, managing crews, handling heavy stone, and dealing with real-world mud while her husband collected design awards. "Heard your mother's speech, did you?" Evelyn asked softly. I sat down on the swing beside her. Evelyn did something she had never done before. She unbuckled a heavy brass drafting tape measure from her leather belt, a tool she had carried onto every job site for 4 decades, and placed it into my palms. It was heavy, cold, and scratched from years of honest labor. "This tape measure has verified the foundation of every public library and park shelter in this county," Evelyn told me quietly. It never once asked if the design looked pretty on paper. It only cared if the structure was square, true, and built to hold people up. I held the brass casing in my hands. "Clara," she continued, looking out into the dark garden, "nobody earns the right to exist, my dear. Love isn't a building permit." 10 months after that evening on the porch swing, my parents officially cut the lines. The college fund my grandparents had set aside for me was officially transferred into Eleanor's postgraduate trust. My father explained the decision in his calm, reasonable voice. "Resources must be concentrated where the return on investment is highest." I didn't argue. I was 19. I had already opened my own independent bank account, retrieved my personal documents from my mother's desk, finished my carpentry certification, and was working 60 hours a week framing residential homes. I loved the work, the smell of fresh pine, the exactness of structural joinery, the tangible reality of a day's work standing tall at sunset. My mother could tolerate a daughter who attempted architecture and failed. She could not tolerate a daughter who happily chose trade work. The final ultimatum arrived on a rainy morning in April. Quit the job site, enroll in a standard university program, and align with the family trajectory, or pack my belongings. I packed my life into 3 heavy plastic tubs in under 40 minutes. Nobody offered to help. Nobody stood at the door to say goodbye. As I reached the front steps, my mother stood in the doorway and said, "You are choosing to be an absolute nobody." "I am choosing to build things that actually stand up," I replied. The heavy oak door shut behind me before I reached the driveway. Which brings us right back to the glass conservatory at the Sterling estate, the champagne flute, and my mother's low surgical voice. Why is our overhead cost sitting in row 3? Eleanor arrived a moment later in a dramatic sweep of silk, holding her bouquet like a defensive shield. You need to leave right now, Eleanor whispered forcefully. Whatever point you think you're making, you will not ruin this day. Congratulations on your wedding, Eleanor, I said evenly. You look radiant. My composure visibly infuriated her. Guests were beginning to glance our way, and my mother felt the shift instantly. She quickly adjusted her expression into her practiced hostess smile. Let's step into the side office for a moment, my mother announced loudly enough for a passing couple to hear, gesturing toward a private corridor as if inviting me on a tour. My father was already waiting inside the room. Raymond Vance, 65 years old. A man who spent 40 years designing glass skyscrapers and 10 years hiding behind his wife's sharp edges. For 9 years, I had held on to a foolish, quiet hope that my father had secretly missed me, that he was simply playing the role of the quiet partner. He looked at me, and here were his exact words. Use the side exit behind the catering pantry. Don't force your mother to make a scene. No, how have you been? No, it's good to see you. Not even my name. I waited for a moment, looking for any trace of regret in his eyes. Nothing. And in that quiet office, I finally realized the truth. His silence had never been weakness. He was an equal partner in the enterprise. He agreed with every single line item. No, I said softly. My father blinked, caught off guard. I left this family's house once through the back door with plastic tubs, I said. I will never use a back door again. My phone vibrated in my clutch. It was a text message from Julian. Arthur is looking for you. He wants to introduce you to his father before the toasts start. The 9 years between my departure and that wedding had been built brick by brick. My first job after leaving home was with a small timber framing restoration crew run by an old master carpenter named Marcus. He paid me $14 an hour to hand chisel mortise and tenon joints on historic barns. I worked until my hands were calloused and my boots were worn thin. I lived in a tiny studio above a bakery, saving every single dollar in an old metal toolbox. While my sister was learning how to render digital models at Yale, I was learning how wood expands under moisture, how structural weight transfers to ground foundations, and how to fix mistakes before the roof goes on. By 24, I took my savings, secured a small commercial loan, and launched Brightwater Timber and Restoration. We didn't draw pretty pictures for gloss magazines. We rebuilt crumbling historical structures, stabilized structural failures, and crafted heavy timber architectural frames for public buildings. My hiring rule was simple. We hire people who respect the craft and respect the site. In 5 years, Brightwater grew from a 2-person shop to a 50-person firm managing historic restoration contracts across 4 states. I was the president and lead structural specialist. Then came the connection no one in my family knew about. 4 years ago, the city of New York launched a major municipal project. The restoration of the historic Maritime Pavilion downtown. The structural engineering lead on the project was a rising, brilliant young architect named Arthur Sterling. Arthur needed a firm capable of restoring massive, centuries-old white oak timber arches without replacing the original framework. Every major contractor turned him down, claiming it was impossible. I walked onto his job site, reviewed the original blueprints, and showed him how to reinforce the internal timber using hidden steel tension rods. Arthur was blown away. He spent 3 years collaborating with Brightwater on public projects, citing our work in architectural journals. He knew me simply as Clara Mercer, a master timber specialist, business owner, and wife of Dr. Julian Mercer. He had no idea I was Clara Vance. And 6 months before his wedding, Arthur asked Brightwater to sponsor a permanent endowment at his alma mater, the Evelyn Chase Architectural Crafts Fellowship, named in honor of my late grandmother, to pay full tuition for trade students learning historic timber restoration. I funded the endowment anonymously through my firm. Arthur was so deeply moved by the unknown donor's generosity that he insisted on inviting Brightwater's founder to his wedding, placing us at table 2 alongside his closest professional mentors. Back in the main ballroom, the ceremony had concluded, and the reception was in full swing. Julian and I sat at table 2. Across the room, my mother picked up the master seating chart. I watched her eyes scan down the printed calligraphy. When her fingers stopped at table 2, Dr. Julian Mercer and Mrs. Clara Mercer, her composure cracked. For 3 seconds, Lorraine Vance lost total control of her face. Table 2 was reserved for honored guests of the groom's family. She looked over at our table, saw Julian in his tailored tux, saw me looking calm and composed in my dark gray gown, and her mind struggled to process the math. She had no idea who Mercer was. She hadn't bothered to learn my married name, my life, or my business. Suddenly, Arthur's father, Richard Sterling, senior partner of Sterling & Sons, walked over to table 2 with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Clara, Julian, I am so thrilled you both made it," Richard said warmly. "Arthur has been talking about Brightwater's latest project all week." My mother, who had been watching from across the room, quickly hurried over, desperate to regain control of the room. "Richard, dear," my mother interjected smoothly, laying a manicured hand on his arm. "I see you've met our distant acquaintance. Clara was just leaving." "Distant acquaintance?" Richard chuckled, looking genuinely confused. "Lorraine, what are you talking about? Clara Mercer runs Brightwater Restoration. She practically saved our Maritime Pavilion project, and her firm fully funded the Evelyn Chase Fellowship that Arthur oversees." My mother froze. Her face went the exact shade of pale concrete. "Evelyn Chase?" my mother whispered, her voice faltering. "Yes," Richard replied. "Named after Arthur's favorite historical site supervisor. We had no idea the donor was sitting right here in our region." Before my mother could construct a lie, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the head table for speeches." My mother was forced to return to her seat, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of terror and furious calculation. My mother toasted first. She stood in her immaculate gown, holding her champagne glass, and delivered an eloquent, polished speech about heritage, perfection, and architectural legacy. In the Vance family, my mother declared proudly to the 200 guests, "Excellence is not merely encouraged, it is required. Everything in our house is earned. We do not tolerate mediocrity, and we do not hand out second chances at our table." The room applauded politely. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling a sudden wave of quiet clarity. She was still quoting the rules of a prison she had built for herself. Then Arthur stood up to speak. He thanked his parents, thanked Eleanor, and then put his written index cards back into his jacket pocket. "I want to take a moment to speak off script," Arthur said into the microphone. "Because architecture isn't just about rendering grand concepts on paper. It's about the hands that build the frame. 2 years ago, my career was saved by a master builder who refused to let an old structure fall. She restored the Maritime Pavilion, and then she quietly funded a multi-million-dollar fellowship in honor of a woman named Evelyn Chase, a woman who dedicated her life to real craft." Arthur pointed directly toward table 2. "Clara Mercer, president of Brightwater, is sitting right there. Clara, would you please stand?" Applause erupted across the ballroom. Guests turned in their chairs to look at me. I stood up politely and offered a modest nod. My sister Eleanor suddenly snapped. The pressure of 9 years of curated perfection collapsed in a single second. She stood up at the head table, her face red, and shouted into the silence following the applause. "She doesn't belong here. She's not an architect. She's just a carpenter who got kicked out of our house." The ballroom went deathly quiet. The silence was so heavy you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Arthur turned slowly to look at his new bride, his expression shifting from confusion to complete shock. "Eleanor, what are you talking about?" Arthur asked quietly into the live microphone. "This is Clara Mercer. Her grandmother was Evelyn Chase." "She's my sister, Arthur," Eleanor blurted out, tears of anger ruining her makeup. "She ruined our family name by working trade jobs. We cut her off 9 years ago. She doesn't exist." Arthur stared at Eleanor. Then he looked over at my mother, who was desperately trying to wave her hands to suppress the commotion, and then back to Richard Sterling. "You told me you were an only child, Eleanor," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "You told my entire family that your parents had only one daughter." My mother quickly stepped toward the center of the room, attempting her final recovery move. Arthur, dear, this is simply a private family misunderstanding, my mother said quickly, offering a strained public laugh. Clara has always been dramatic. We will discuss this privately. She reached out to grab my arm, her fingers tightening like a clamp, whispering harshly under her breath. Play along, Clara. Tell them it was a family joke, and you can come back home. The empty frame is yours. You've earned it. I looked down at her hand on my arm. I looked at my father, who was staring at the floorboards, and at Eleanor, whose immaculate facade had completely disintegrated. I gently, firmly removed my mother's hand from my sleeve. No, Mother, I said in a clear, measured voice that carried to the first 4 tables. I don't need your frame. I built my own structure. I turned to Richard Sterling and Arthur. Thank you for the lovely toast, Arthur, I said politely. I wish you the very best with your restoration projects. Julian and I will take our leave now. I took Julian's arm. We walked straight down the center aisle of the glass conservatory, past 200 silent guests, through the front double doors, and out into the cool evening air. We didn't run to our car. We walked calmly out to the terrace overlooking the Hudson River. Julian pulled his tuxedo jacket off and placed it gently over my shoulders. I reached into my clutch bag and pulled out the old brass tape measure my grandmother had given me 10 years ago. I held the heavy brass tool in my hand, feeling its weight, and for the first time in 9 years, I let out a long, quiet breath. I didn't cry for the family I had lost. You cannot lose a seat that was never built for you. I felt only the immense, quiet relief of a structure that no longer had to bear an impossible weight. The fallout from that evening unfolded over the next 6 months. Arthur Sterling filed for an annulment 8 weeks after the wedding. It wasn't merely because of my existence. When the Sterling family began reviewing the Vance family's background, they discovered that Eleanor's prestigious design firm was heavily subsidized by my parents and had defaulted on multiple commercial leases. The entire Vance architectural dynasty was a house of cards held together by gloss magazine features and unearned pride. My mother resigned from her position on the municipal design board later that autumn, citing health reasons. Her social currency had completely vanished in the precise circles she had spent 40 years cultivating. My father sent me a single email 3 months later. The body of the message contained one line. Your grandmother's tape measure was always accurate. I read the email once, archived it, and never replied. The gallery wall in Westchester still hangs with 11 mahogany frames and 1 empty map board. It no longer holds any power over me. 6 months after the wedding, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, I sat at the head of a long, hand-carved oak dining table in the backyard of our Brooklyn townhome. Julian was at the far end, pouring drinks for our lead restoration crew. Marcus, my original carpentry mentor, was laughing over a plate of grilled vegetables. 3 young trade students from the Evelyn Chase Fellowship were debating timber joinery techniques with Arthur Sterling, who remained a valued professional partner and close personal friend. On the brick wall of our courtyard, there are no framed diplomas or mahogany certificates. There is only a single photo of my grandmother Evelyn sitting on her porch swing, holding a cup of tea, looking out at a world she helped build with her own 2 hands. If you have ever been made to feel like you had to perform, audition, or shrink yourself to earn a seat at your own family's table, take this story as your official permission to stand up and walk out. Love that must be constantly earned is not love. It is simply an unpaid contract. And you are fully allowed to break the lease. The table you build with your own hands will always hold the people who actually belong in your life. Thank you for listening to Clara's story on Quiet Thunder. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next episode.